Hello there, and welcome back to part 2 of my 15th century adventure, in which I'm attempting to recreate this gown from St. George Slaying the Dragon by Jost Haller, dated to circa 1450. If you missed out on part 1, you may wish to go back and give that a quick watch, unless of course you're only interested in sleeves and trimmings and finishings, in which by all means, do stick around. And without further ado, let's go finish this lady. When I left you last, I had just completed the long process of seaming together the gown panels and checking the fit, so now it's time to finish off all these seams. This is done by trimming one side of the seam allowance to a narrow width, so that the other side can be folded over both edges and stitched down with a felling stitch, or whip stitch, to encase all of the fraying. Funnily enough, I spent so many piecemeal hours doing this over about 2 weeks and never actually managed to turn on the camera for any of it, but not to worry, there's plenty more felling to come if you need a demonstration. The center front edges, if you remember, were cut along the selvage. This was a common practice used throughout history in order to save fabric and to eliminate that extra bit of time in trimming and folding for felled seams, since the selvages can just be running stitched down and won't fray. Many archaeological finds from the medieval period actually exhibit raw cut seams finished in this way, but hand-woven fabrics tended to be much more tightly woven and less prone to fraying, unlike my modern machine-woven fabric, so I've just kept with the felling for the rest of my seams. And now that the base of the gown is complete, it's time to get started on the sleeves. The gown in the painting appears to have a false undersleeve attached to the long sleeve of the gown. I assume this is the case, rather than it being a sleeve from an undergown or kirtle, since we do get to see a bit of her shift between the wide center front opening, with no hint of a green kirtle or the closures for one at this point. False undersleeves are something I understand to have been a common feature of gowns in the Tudor period a couple of decades later, so this probably isn't entirely impossible. So I found this beautiful green changeable silk on 39th Street, which I plan to use for the undersleeves. If you recall from part 1, my experiment with marking out the wool in quill and ink was very successful. I decided to try out this method on the silk with the sleeves, and it was much less successful. The silk is much more loosely woven and the ink wanted to spread and soak through to the other side. 0 out of 10, would not recommend this method for finer fabrics. I'm just stitching together the sleeve seams with a very small back stitch. Since the silk thread I'm using is very fine, I've doubled the thread to strengthen the seam, but this probably wouldn't be necessary with a heavier thread. Now I've decided to put a button placket in the cuffs of the sleeves, since this was a very common feature of the period, in order to achieve that fashionable tight-fitted look. You can't see them on the gown in the painting, but judging from how tightly her sleeves are fitted, without, of course, the generous help of spandex, I have to surmise that there is some sort of closure method at the inside seam of the sleeves in order to achieve that fit. Surviving sleeves show that buttonhole edges were faced with a layer of strong linen, or silk in the case of finer fabrics such as this, and so I've gone ahead and cut a facing to add to the underside of my buttonhole edge. This has also been backstitched to the edge of the sleeve seam, right sides together, then flipped inside to finish the edge. Then I started marking out the buttonholes lightly with ink. I did do a sample of this beforehand, which I highly recommend before starting the buttonhole process, so I knew that the buttons that I picked for this project would require a 1/2 inch hole to go through. Now because this stitch takes quite a bit of explaining if you're not yet familiar with it, I've gone ahead and filmed a separate video tutorial if you need a quick lesson on hand finishing your buttonholes. But since you're probably just here to see the making of a 15th century dress, however, I'm going to spare you the details for now and just get on with it. And now for buttons. Metal cast buttons are a common find in medieval archaeological sites, though I must disclaim that these look quite different from the ones that I was able to find in the garment district. These are quite pretty, but from images of the extant examples that I found for reference, medieval buttons tended to be flatter, cast in 2 halves with a metal shank on the back. The ones I picked I think are actually supposed to be beads. I've rigged them up with a bit of thread so that they attach in a similar way as the thread-wrapped button styles common by the 16th century, but there probably isn't much historical validity to this decision. Oh, and for some reason I forgot to finish the edges of the sleeve seam when I stitched it together earlier, so I'm just doing that now with that felling stitch I was talking about earlier. Then I'm just quickly finishing off the cuff edges with a bit more turning and felling. Okay, but back to the buttons. I'm using a large tapestry needle to thread the tails of the button shank through. Then I can just push it through the fabric where I want the button to sit, and tie it off securely at the back. I tried this at first by making a hole with an awl and then pushing the tails through, as I thought this might have been the more likely historical method, but this proved to create too large a gap in the weave of the fabric, and the knot at the inside wouldn't stop the button from pulling free. This method was much more effective, though I was still too afraid to cut off the excess tails in case they ever needed to be retied, so shh. Also, I just forgot to address this at the time, but the edges just finished off with a really tiny felt hem. I suspect that historically this hem would have fully encased the beautifully trimmed knots on the inside, but again, I was mistrustful and wanted to have easy access to them if I needed. This probably wouldn't have been an issue with tighter woven historical fabrics. So now it's time for the oversleeves. Forewarning here that there is a massive amount of conjecture in how I decided these sleeves work, so do proceed with caution. I decided that the seam for these sleeves needed to run down the back of the arm, since there doesn't appear to be a seam down front on the painting, and this way I could insert a gore in the back to help achieve that voluminous amount of fabric at the hem. This meant that in order to be able to even remotely move my arms, I had to cut a slit to insert a gusset at the underarm point. Again, absolutely zero evidence for this, but the sleeves just wouldn't be functional without it. And hey, gussets in general are period appropriate, so... By the way, I found it really helped to get my head around the pattern for these sleeves before drafting by making a wee sample piece just to get an idea of the general shape. Definitely recommend if you're like me and extremely geometrically challenged. The piece ended up to be a bit wider than my fabric, but that's okay. Back in the days of narrower fabric widths and a much more conservative attitude towards fabric usage, piecing was very, very common. Speaking of clever fabric usage, this triangular cutout for the front slit of the sleeve will be inserted at the back as a gore, and the pieces are marked out, much more successfully with the ink on the wool this time. Now, since we get a bit of contrast material in the reference gown, I've made the assumption that the sleeves are lined with a nice peachy changeable silk. So now I'm just going ahead and repeating the marking and cutting process for the undersleeve lining. And this time I'm not going to attempt the ink here with the silk. I know through later periods of dressmaking, charcoal, graphite, and chalk were also used in marking pieces, so I'm taking the liberty of employing some white tailor's chalk to mark these out. Yes, there is an additional piecing on this one, since the silk was a bit narrower than the wool, and I also needed a piecing for the gore triangle. First things first is to get the piecings on so we have our full pattern pieces again. I tried to do that clever thing where at least one edge of the seam is cut on a selvage to eliminate having to turn an extra time in finishing, but then I remembered that the undersleeve is lined, so I don't have to finish the raw edges anyway. The piecings are attached with a quick running back stitch. These seams aren't structural and don't need to take any stress, so speed was definitely more my priority over strength. Now to start actually putting the sleeves together. I'm starting by pinning the gore into place with the tip finishing just at the elbow point. I'm then stitching it into place with a running back stitch using some linen thread. I had dyed this with the intention of matching the red fabric, but it came out decidedly pinker than intended. Oh well, maybe it's a bit better than white. And again, this is repeated on the lining pieces. Then the center back seam can be finished, running straight down the other side of the gore panel. Once again, this is attached using a running back stitch. Then I can finally put the lining and fabric pieces together. To finish off the edges, I started by turning in the edges of both layers and slip stitching them together, but for the hem edge, I figured out that the layers could be turned and felled, which I think might be the slightly more historically accurate method. Now I'm inserting the undersleeves, matching them up without balance marks because I'm a heathen, and basting them together. Then they're attached to the gown with a strong backstitch using plain, heavy linen thread. Then I'm finishing off the raw edge of the arm's eye by felling it down with some red silk thread. This was a bit of a struggle since I had cut my upper seam allowance a little bit too narrow, so it ended up a bit sloppier than I had hoped. Then I'm finishing off the hem with, you guessed it, some more felling. You might have noticed that I like to anchor my seams at the nearer end, here by pinning it to a small cushion. This was a common practice used throughout history, and I've become quite fond of it. It allows you to pull the fabric taut and keep the work at a nice tension so your stitches are more even and go quicker. And now it's just time for a bit of finishing. The reference gown gets some little gold detailing around the neck edge. I found a nice semi-metallic trim here in the garment district, which seemed to have a nice little echo of the dotted effect on the reference gown. This just gets folded in half over the raw edge and felled into place with a plain, lightweight linen thread. I played with the idea that this might be beading. I imagined that beadwork as chunky as it seems in the picture would be quite heavy and would want to warp against the biased edges. A bit of metallic trim, however, would not only reinforce the edge with a bit of stiffness and strength, but could also act as a binding for the raw edge. So this is what I decided to go with. Right at the top of the sleeve slits is a small bit of lacing, so now I'm just putting in the eyelet holes for that. Remember, when making your eyelet holes, use an awl to gently separate the weave of the fabric without actually breaking any of the threads to ensure that your eyelet holes are durable and your fabric remains stable. Once the eyelets are all bound off, I like to go through and widen them a bit more with a bodkin, but since I don't actually have a proper bodkin, I'm just using one of my hairpins. It works just the same. Then the lace can be inserted into the eyelet holes. This is a 5-strand finger loop braid that I plaited myself in a previous video, if you're curious on how to make some historically accurate lacing strands for yourself. And last but not least, the closures. I found some nice little cast metal hook clasps here in the garment district that have a similar feel to the ones in the painting, but of course probably have very little actual historical authenticity. This is something that I just decided to embrace since I don't at present have the resources to cast them or have them cast custom. And with that, the gown is complete. Similar enough? I know I addressed the possibility of a waist seam in my previous video in order to achieve the pleating effect happening at center front on the reference. I wish I'd also cut the slits in the sleeves a bit higher and used whatever sorcery that was applied to achieve those perfectly smooth sleeves and bodice, but I guess we can't have it all. For the photos I just used a metal plate girdle that I had handy, a style that was utilized in the period, but the one in the reference clearly isn't made from metal pieces. I discovered that many extant girdles were tablet woven in narrow, girdle-sized widths, and in this case looks as if it might contain metallic fibers, so as soon as I take up tablet weaving, I shall get back to you with an updated replica. So that's all for this project. Thank you so much for sticking with it this far. I hope it was at least vaguely of interest. I'm always over here making things by hand and generally just screaming about the wonders of historical dress. So if you want to join in the fun, tap that little red button down there, and I shall see you soon on my next historical sewing adventure.